364 days of the year, the house was silent. On the 365th, it was silent, too, but with the added weight of expectation. Ada sat on her threadbare sofa, a gray wool sweater pulled tight around her, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint whistle of wind against the windowpane. Christmas Eve. The words felt like they belonged to someone else, to a life painted in warmer colors. Her world was a palette of grays and blues, the color of her sweater, the color of the twilight deepening outside. She had a single string of lights, pale yellow bulbs casting soft, lonely circles on the wall. They flickered, threatening to go out, a perfect metaphor for the hope she barely managed to keep lit inside her. The air smelled of the cinnamon stick she'd boiled in a pot of water on the stove, a cheap trick to make the small space feel like a home. It was enough. It had to be. Then came the sound, a low, guttural rumble that didn't belong to the neighborhood's usual symphony of distant sirens and barking dogs. It was the sound of engines, not one, but many, idling in unison. It grew, a wave of mechanical power cresting right outside her door. Ada froze, her hand halfway to the chipped ceramic mug on the coffee table. She crept to the window, pulling the thin curtain aside just enough to see. Her breath hitched. The street, usually empty save for a stray car or two, was lined with black sedans, their polished surfaces gleaming under the weak glow of the street lamp. They were identical, menacing, like a row of obsidian coffins. Men began to emerge, dozens of them, all dressed in dark, severe suits that seemed to absorb the light. They moved with a chilling, disciplined silence, fanning out to form a perimeter, their faces hard and unreadable in the gloom. An army had descended on her quiet street. At the center of it all, a man stepped out of the lead car. He was different. Taller, with a stillness that commanded attention even from a distance. He adjusted the lapels of his immaculate black suit, a flash of crisp white visible at his collar. Even through the glass, she could feel the authority radiating from him, a dense, heavy presence that made the air feel thin. He walked towards her door, his steps measured and deliberate on the snow-dusted pavement. Two men flanked him, but they kept a respectful distance. He stopped on her small porch, his form a stark silhouette against the swirling snow that had begun to fall. A knock echoed through the house. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was firm, undeniable. A command. Ada's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was not the police. This was something else entirely, something older and far more dangerous. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful, it was predatory. Another knock, just as patient, just as final as the first. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her soul, that ignoring it was not an option. She opened the door a crack, the safety chain pulled taut. The cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of winter and something metallic, like shed blood. The man on her porch stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on hers. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, his features sharp and intelligent. There was no visible menace in his expression, only a profound weariness, but the power behind it was unmistakable. He was the undisputed leader of these men, a powerful Korean Mafia boss whose reputation likely preceded him in circles she could not even imagine. Behind him, his men stood like statues, a silent testament to his authority. The falling snow dusted his dark hair and the shoulders of his suit, but he seemed oblivious to the cold. He did not speak immediately, simply held her gaze, assessing her home, her fear. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threat and a strange, desperate gravity. Ada could feel the stares of all 50 men on her small house, on the sliver of light spilling from her doorway. They were a single, unified entity, and he was their center. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, smooth baritone that cut through the whistling wind. "We need shelter," it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of need so profound it transcended politeness. Then, after a beat of silence that felt like an eternity, he added a single word that shattered her understanding of the situation. Please, the word hung in the frozen air between them, impossibly soft, impossibly vulnerable. It was a crack in the granite facade, a plea from a man who looked as if he had never pleaded for anything in his life. Ada's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, to bolt it, to hide. But the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet desperation in that one word, held her captive. This was a man accustomed to taking, not asking. For him to ask, the situation had to be dire. He was a mafia boss, a king in his own world, and his kingdom was clearly under siege. There was a fight, he said, his voice dropping even lower, meant for her alone. My men are injured. The cold is not our friend tonight. He gestured vaguely back at the silent ranks, and for the first time, she noticed some of them were leaning on their comrades, their movements stiff with pain. The metallic scent she'd smelled was real. It was blood. The choice before her was simple and impossible. Let a wolf into her home, or leave him and his pack to the mercy of the storm and whatever hunted them. She looked past him, at the silent, watching men, and then back to his face. There was no deception there, only a stark, brutal honesty. He was a dangerous man, the kind she had only ever seen in movies, but tonight, he was also just a man seeking refuge from a storm, both literal and of his own making. Her hand trembled as she reached up and slid the chain free. The click of the metal was deafeningly loud in the sudden stillness. She pulled the door open. The invasion was silent, orderly, and absolute. The men filed in one by one, their movements economical and disciplined, a river of black wool and cold steel flowing into her small, warm home. They filled every available space, lining the walls of the tiny living room, standing shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, their presence shrinking her world until she felt like a mouse in a cage full of panthers. The air, once scented with cinnamon, was now thick with the smell of damp coats, freezing air, and the faint, sharp tang of antiseptic and blood. Her single string of lights reflected in 50 pairs of dark, watchful eyes. They did not speak. They did not touch anything. They simply existed, a monolithic force of contained violence that soaked up all the warmth and quiet of her sanctuary. Ada pressed herself into the corner of her small kitchen, her hands wrapped around her elbows, trying to make herself as small as possible. She watched the man who had knocked on her door, the mafia boss, as he stood in the center of the room. He surveyed the space with a calm, appraising gaze, his eyes missing nothing: the worn-out sofa, the crack in the ceiling, the handful of Christmas cards taped to the wall from distant relatives. He was not judging, merely observing, cataloging the details of the world he had just forcibly entered. A taller, broader man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow approached him, speaking in low, rapid Korean. The mafia boss listened, nodded once, and replied in the same language. The scarred man, clearly his second in command, turned and issued a series of quiet orders. Instantly, the men began to organize themselves. A few, who were clearly medics, moved through the ranks, tending to the wounded with practiced efficiency, producing sterile pads and bandages from hidden pockets in their coats. Others took up positions near the windows and the door, their stillness now charged with a predatory alertness. They were guards, sentinels. They had not sought shelter so much as they had occupied a new, temporary fortress. And she was its sole, terrified inhabitant. The powerful Korean mafia boss turned his attention back to her. He walked towards the kitchen, his polished shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum. He stopped a few feet away, creating a small pocket of space around them in the crowded house. I am in June, he said, the name sounding foreign and solid. He did not offer a hand to shake. It was not an introduction between equals. It was the courtesy a king might extend to a subject whose lands he was temporarily borrowing. My apologies for the intrusion. The apology felt sincere, yet it changed nothing. The apology of a storm for the damage it caused. Do you have water? He asked. His voice was calm, but she saw it then, a thin, dark line of blood tracing a path from his hairline down his temple, partially hidden by his black hair. A fine tremor ran through his hand as he brushed it away, his knuckles white. The king was wounded. The sight of the blood, a stark crimson against his pale skin, broke through her paralysis. It was a flaw in his perfect, intimidating armor, a sign of the violence he had just escaped. He was not an abstract concept of danger anymore. He was a bleeding man standing in her kitchen. Her fear was still a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but another instinct began to stir alongside it. A deep, ingrained impulse to mend what was broken. It was an instinct that had cost her dearly in the past, drawing her to wounded things, but it was as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. She nodded mutely and turned to the sink, her movements stiff and jerky. She filled a glass with water, her hand shaking so badly that some of it sloshed over the side. When she turned back, he was watching her, his gaze intense and unreadable. He took the glass from her, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. His skin was cold, but a strange jolt, like static electricity, shot up her arm. He drank the water in 3 long swallows, his throat working. He was a mafia boss, a man of immense power, yet he drank water from her chipped glass like any other thirsty man. He set the glass down on the counter with a soft click.
"Thank you," he said.
The words were quiet, but they resonated in the tense silence of the room. She found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. "You're hurt." It was a statement, not a question. His eyes flickered, a brief flash of surprise that he was so transparent to her. He touched his temple again, his fingers coming away stained. "It is nothing," he dismissed, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed him. Ada hesitated for only a moment. Then she opened a cupboard and pulled out the small plastic box that served as her first aid kit. It was a pathetic collection of colorful cartoon bandages, a half-empty tube of antiseptic cream, and a few sterile gauze pads. It was meant for scraped knees and kitchen accidents, not for wounds sustained in a mafia war. She placed it on the counter between them. He stared at the box, then at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes, amusement, perhaps, or disbelief. But he did not refuse. He simply stood there, waiting. Taking a deep breath, Ada opened the kit. She took out a gauze pad and dampened it with water from the tap. Her heart was still pounding, a frantic drumbeat against the silent backdrop of his watchful men. This was insane. She was about to tend to the wound of a crime lord, the leader of this silent army that had taken over her life. She reached up, her hand hesitating a fraction of an inch from his face. "May I?" she whispered. For a long moment he was utterly still. She could feel the collective gaze of his men on her back, a physical weight of scrutiny. Then he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Her touch was tentative as she gently dabbed at the cut on his temple. The wound was clean, a shallow slice, but it had bled enough to be alarming. He didn't flinch or pull away. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, giving her a level of trust that was both terrifying and strangely intimate. The powerful mafia boss, who commanded 50 men with a single glance, was letting her, a complete stranger, touch his face with a vulnerability that seemed entirely at odds with the man he was. The silence in the kitchen was profound. It felt as if they were in a bubble, separated from the tense watchfulness of the men in the other room. All she could hear was the soft rasp of the gauze against his skin and the sound of her own breathing. She worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed, cleaning the blood away, her movements becoming more confident. The metallic scent was stronger now, mixed with the clean, masculine scent of his cologne. He was so close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, but his eyes held the weariness of a much older man. When she was done cleaning the wound, she opened a small packet of antiseptic cream. She squeezed a tiny amount onto her fingertip and paused. He opened his eyes, his dark gaze locking onto hers. The intensity of it made her breath catch. It felt as if he were looking past her skin, past her fear, and seeing the very core of her. She held his gaze as she gently applied the cream to the cut.
He did not blink.
Finally, she took one of the plain, non-cartoon bandages and carefully placed it over the wound. Her fingers lingered for a moment on his temple, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the cold that had permeated the house. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "There," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's all I have." Minjun raised his hand and lightly touched the bandage, his expression unreadable. He looked from the first aid kit on the counter to her face. "You show kindness to a man who invaded your home," he stated, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question seeking an answer, but a quiet observation, a puzzle he was trying to solve. "You're bleeding," she replied simply, as if that explained everything. And in her world it did. You saw a wound, and you tended to it. You saw a need, and you filled it. It was a simple, uncomplicated code, a universe away from the brutal calculus of loyalty and betrayal that he likely lived by. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then he gave another one of his small, sharp nods. "Kong," he called out without raising his voice. The scarred man appeared at his side instantly. "See that the woman is not disturbed. She is to be treated as a guest in her own home. No one speaks to her unless I command it. No one touches anything. Is that understood?" "Yes, boss," Kong replied, his eyes flicking to Ada for a brief, assessing moment before he turned and relayed the orders in Korean. The Mafia boss had drawn a line of protection around her, a strange and unsettling act of chivalry from the very source of her fear. Hours crawled by. The initial adrenaline of terror slowly subsided, replaced by a surreal, waiting tension. The blizzard that had been threatening all evening finally descended, a thick, swirling curtain of white that erased the world outside the windows. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like an ark, adrift in a sea of snow and silence, filled with dangerous cargo.
Minunes Manuelcosts.
They remained in their designated spots, impossibly still, their discipline absolute. Some slept on their feet, leaning against the walls, while others kept a ceaseless, silent watch. They were a living, breathing security system, and Ada was at its quiet center. She retreated to the worn armchair in the corner, the closest thing she had to a defensible position, and wrapped a thin blanket around her shoulders. Minjun had taken the sofa. He sat not like a guest, but like a king holding court, his posture relaxed but radiating an undeniable authority that made the threadbare piece of furniture seem like a throne. He hadn't spoken again since the incident in the kitchen. He simply watched, his gaze sometimes resting on her, sometimes drifting to the window where the snow lashed against the glass. The house was quiet save for the howl of the wind and the occasional, low-murmured exchange in Korean between the men. It was a strange, domestic tableau, a parody of a peaceful Christmas Eve. Here they were, a poor, lonely woman and a powerful Korean mafia boss with his private army, trapped together by a storm. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, but fear had leached all the humor from the situation. Ada watched him from under her lashes. In the soft, flickering glow of her Christmas lights, the hard edges of his face seemed to soften. The weariness she had seen at the door was more pronounced now, etched into the lines around his eyes. He looked like a man carrying the weight of 50 lives on his shoulders, a burden that allowed for no rest. The quiet was finally broken by his voice, startling her. "You are alone on Christmas Eve." It was a simple observation, devoid of pity, spoken so softly she wondered if she'd imagined it. She looked at him directly. "Yes," he considered her answer for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Family? Not here," she said. "They're far away. It is a bad night to be alone," he said, and the words felt like a confession. He was surrounded by 50 loyal men, a wall of muscle and devotion, yet Ada had the distinct impression that he was the loneliest person in the room. He was the mafia boss, the leader, and such a position was isolating by its very nature. He could command, he could protect, he could kill, but he could not share the burden. They existed in their separate solitudes, a shared loneliness that was now the only common ground between them. The snow fell harder, piling up against the door, sealing them in. The world outside had vanished. There was only this room, the storm, and the silent, waiting men. He shifted on the sofa, the movement drawing her attention. The faint light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the dark intensity of his eyes. The silence had become a living thing, a space for things to grow. He seemed to come to a decision, as if weighing the risk of speaking against the oppression of not. "They were waiting for us," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the storm. "At the port." It was supposed to be a negotiation. Ada listened, her body rigid in the armchair. She knew he was not obligated to explain anything to her. This was not for her benefit. It was for his. The act of speaking the truth, even a sliver of it, into the quiet room. Someone from the inside gave them our route, our numbers. A betrayal. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "We lost good men." He did not say it with sadness, but with a flat, cold anger that was far more chilling. It was the voice of a man who dealt in consequences, who understood that loss was a part of the equation, but who would never forgive the treachery that caused it. "This life," he continued, his gaze distant, fixed on the swirling snow outside the window, "is built on loyalty. It is the only currency that matters. When it is devalued, everything falls apart." He was giving her a glimpse into his world, a brutal, unforgiving place governed by a strict, archaic code. A world where a single act of disloyalty could lead to a snowy street filled with bodies and a desperate flight into the night. He was the Mafia boss, and this was the reality of his crown. "We fought our way out," he said, his voice hardening. "But we were exposed. Hunted. This was the closest place to disappear. Your street was dark. Your house was quiet." He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers across the small room. "You were a risk. But the street was a certainty. It was a cold calculation, the logic of a general on a battlefield." Her home, her life, had been weighed against his men's survival, and the choice had been simple for him. Yet he had told her. He had given her the context for his invasion, an explanation that was also a warning. He was showing her who he was, not a monster, but a man shaped by a monstrous world, a leader who had made a hard choice to protect his people.
She didn't know what to say.
"I'm sorry" felt hollow and inadequate. "I understand" felt like a lie. So she said nothing. She simply held his gaze, her silence a form of acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement of the brutal truth he had laid at her feet. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted again. He was not just her captor, and she was not just his victim. They were two people, caught in the eye of a storm, sharing a moment of stark, unvarnished honesty on the loneliest night of the year. The fragile peace was shattered by the shrill, electronic chirp of a burner phone. The sound was alien in the quiet house, a violent intrusion from the world they were hiding from. Kong, the scarred second-in-command, materialized at Minjun's side, holding the small, black device. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The men who had been resting were suddenly awake and alert, their bodies tensing, their hands moving instinctively to the weapons hidden beneath their jackets. The air crackled with renewed danger. Minjun took the phone, his expression hardening into a mask of cold command. He listened for a few moments, his face betraying nothing, before speaking a few short, sharp words in Korean and ending the call. He handed the phone back to Kong. "They found the warehouse," he said in English, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was speaking to his lieutenant, but his eyes were on Ada. "They are sweeping the district, block by block." The words landed like stones in the pit of her stomach. The hunters were closing in. The brief illusion of safety, of a sanctuary sealed by the storm, was gone. He had not escaped his enemies. He had merely led them here, to her quiet street, to her front door. Her home was no longer a shelter, it was a target. The Mafia boss stood up, his movements fluid and decisive. The weary man who had confessed his betrayal was gone, replaced by the formidable leader. "We move in 10 minutes, he commanded. Kong nodded. "The cars. They will be liabilities. We go on foot. The storm is our cover. We will cut through the back alleys to the river." The order was given, and the men began to move with the same silent efficiency as when they had arrived. Coats were buttoned, weapons checked, and the wounded were helped to their feet. The house, which had been a silent, static tableau, was now a whirlwind of quiet, purposeful activity. They were preparing for war.
Min jo nok til at tog her.
He stood before her armchair, looking down at her, his shadow falling over her. She had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. The full, terrifying force of his power was on display now, the calm, controlled lethality of a true predator. "They will not know we were here," he said, his voice low and firm. "My men will leave no trace. When they pass this house, they will see only a dark window on a quiet street." It was a promise. But it was a promise that acknowledged the immense danger he had brought upon her. He knew that if his enemies suspected she had sheltered him, her life would be forfeit. But, he continued, his eyes searching hers, there is always a risk. A stray witness. A footprint in the snow. He was laying out the consequences, forcing her to see the reality of her situation. He had made her a part of his world, and there was no easy way out. The powerful Korean Mafia boss was telling her, in his own way, that he might have just signed her death warrant. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He placed it on the small table beside her chair. It was stuffed with cash, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "This is for the trouble," he said. "For the risk. It will be enough for you to leave this place. To start somewhere new, where no one can find you." Ada stared at the envelope, then back at his face. The money was a solution, a clean, simple answer to a dirty, complicated problem. It was also a dismissal, payment for services rendered. It erased the intimacy of the shared silence, the vulnerability of the wound she had tended, and reduced their encounter to a transaction. "I don't want it," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. His eyes narrowed slightly. "It is not a request. I didn't help you for money," she insisted, standing up, so she was no longer looking up at him. They were almost eye to eye. "I helped you because you were hurt." For the first time since he had arrived, he seemed thrown off balance. He studied her face, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. He lived in a world where everything had a price, where loyalty was bought and sold, where kindness was a weakness to be exploited. Her simple, unconditional act of humanity did not compute. He was a mafia boss, used to dealing with greed, fear, and ambition. He did not know what to do with compassion. "Take it," he said, his voice softer now, losing its hard edge of command. "Please. Think of it not as payment, but as a weapon. The only one I can give you to protect yourself from the world I have brought to your door." He was reframing it, making it an act of his protection, not an insult to her charity. He was giving her the means to survive the consequences of his presence. "Kong," he called over his shoulder. "Give her your other phone." The clean 1-inch Kong approached and placed a small, sleek burner phone on top of the envelope. "There is one number in it," Minjun explained.
Mine.
"If you are ever in trouble, if you ever feel you are being watched, you use it. One time. I will answer. I will fix it. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. This was his code. He had incurred a debt by endangering her, and he was now providing the means to repay it, in his own violent, absolute way. He was offering her the most valuable thing he possessed, the protection of the powerful Korean Mafia boss himself. His men were assembled at the door, a silent column ready to melt back into the storm. He turned to leave, then hesitated. He looked back at her, his gaze lingering on her face for a long moment. He took a half-step back towards her, raised his hand as if to touch her cheek, then let it fall to his side. An unspoken word, a feeling without a name, passed between them in the charged silence. "Be safe, Ada," he whispered, using her name for the first and only time. Then he turned and was gone, the last of the dark river of men to flow out of her house, swallowed by the raging blizzard. The door clicked shut, and the silence that descended was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, a vacuum where the sheer presence of 50 men had been only moments before. The house felt vast and empty, the air thin and cold. Ada stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself, listening. The only sound was the howling of the wind, a lonely, mournful cry. The house no longer felt like her own. It was a space haunted by the memory of them, of him. She could still smell the faint scent of his cologne, of cold wool and blood. She walked to the window and peered out, but there was nothing to see. The storm had already erased them, swallowing their footprints, leaving behind a blank, undisturbed canvas of white. It was as if they had never been there at all, a fevered dream born of loneliness and Christmas Eve. But they had been there. The proof sat on her side table, a thick white envelope and a slim black phone. A choice and a promise. She slowly walked over and picked up the envelope. It was heavy, the corners of the bills crisp and sharp. It was a new life, a ticket out of this small, gray existence. It was also blood money, the proceeds of a world she wanted no part of. Beside it lay the phone, a cold, smooth piece of plastic that held a single, dangerous connection. A lifeline to a man who solved problems with violence, a direct line to the powerful Korean Mafia boss. It was both a comfort and a terrifying burden. She sank back into the armchair, the one she had huddled in while he watched her from the sofa. She could still see the indentation his body had made in the worn cushions. She pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders, but it offered no warmth. The chill she felt was deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The night had changed her. It had cracked open the quiet, predictable shell of her life and shown her a glimpse of a world that ran on a different set of rules, a world of loyalty and betrayal, of violence and a strange, protective honor. She had looked into the eyes of a killer and had not seen a monster, but a weary, burdened man. She had tended his wound, and in return, he had offered her the keys to a new life and the shield of his formidable power. The first faint light of dawn began to filter through the window, turning the gray sky to a soft, pearlescent pink. The snow had stopped falling. The storm had passed. It was Christmas morning. The world outside was hushed and clean, blanketed in pristine snow. Ada looked from the envelope in her hand to the silent phone, and then out at the new day. She was still alone, in her small, quiet house. But something was different. She was no longer just waiting for her life to happen. She had been given a choice. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but its resilient, more cautious cousin, the possibility of tomorrow.